All right. Well, thank you very much, Rabbi Wardy, for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here today, and hopefully I can live up to the introduction, and we'll go from there. So why don't we start off with a little bit on what the Warrior Group is? So a little bit about me and how I got here. So as Rabbi Wardy said, I started my career as a food and bev startup. I was an entrepreneur. And I was flying blind for a lot of the financial items that we'll get into today. And essentially, I figured that there was just this big gap, and I didn't really know what it was or how to solve it. So I went into the investment banking world. I was there for about 5 years, all in, and kind of figured some stuff out, I hope, spent my time there. And then the goal of Warrior is to bring some of that infrastructure, that support, specifically on the financial modeling side and on the finance side, to the smaller companies to solve some of the problems that we're getting into today. So that's a little bit about me. And yes, the person on my right is my mom. I figured that I have to have a decent amount of confidence to put that out there. So she's the strategic consultant. She's a serial entrepreneur. She's amazing. And she's also part of Warrior Group, transforming companies from reactive to proactive. So that's a little bit about us. And then with that, we'll go into what we're dealing with today. So first, we're going to talk about the struggles of small businesses. And hopefully this is something that's relatable to everybody and where they are. We're then going to go to forecasting and modeling 101. And then we're going to talk about how you can start, and we'll leave some room for Q&A at the end. So the struggles of small businesses. Most businesses, at least until they're, I don't know, 10, 15 million in revenue, they have this reactive stance to operations, right? Everything is kind of just coming at you all at once. There's not a lot you can do, and very reactive. In terms of decision making, there's a lot of intuition, right? Or guidance from colleagues, but you're not doing it based on hard facts. You're just trying to make it through the day to day without visibility into what's going on, how things meet your bottom line. Products are unorganized, services are kind of everywhere. There's not accountability, there's not metrics, there's not goals. There's a lot of trial and error, and there's sometimes a lot of unforeseen items that come up at you, right? So hopefully this is something that's relatable, because I know that I definitely experienced it. So the question is like, well, why does this happen, right? How does this kind of happen, and why is this universal struggles for businesses? So I think the first thing is that businesses are often focused on operations first, right? There's this structure. When I say this evolutionary structure of a business, it kind of comes together because someone had an idea. It ended up working out that they got this customer, they got this supplier, this vendor, they got this warehouse, and everything kind of just comes together. And how often does someone come, like, take a step back and say, well, actually, I need to look at this from a holistic perspective and start making decisions in a way that makes sense, as opposed to just reacting to everything that comes at me. The second part is that CEOs are often focused on operations, right? The operations are the bread and butter of the business. They essentially, the thought is that, well, I actually need to go out and make sales. I need to go out and make products, or else nothing happens. The analyzing of that and whatever happens after is kind of the secondary. It's almost siloed into another bucket. And I think the third part of that is that financial literacy and focus isn't a given in small businesses, right? Oftentimes it's, I need to focus on operations first, and I'll focus on finances second. So where your business could be, hopefully the inverse of all of that. Imagine a world where everything could be proactive. You could know all of these different situations in advance, right? 6, 8 months in advance, if you know you're going to be short on cash flow. Imagine you can make decisions, right, that are informed based on data, not because you feel products should be priced at $10 or $6 or whatever you're pricing it at, but you'd actually have the entirety of what that decision would be. Imagine that you had clarity on day-to-day operations and how it affects your cash flow. Imagine that you could see into the future with relative certainty of what your company would look like. You'd have visibility. Imagine that you could create KPIs, goals, and metrics, and then hold people accountable to that because you're able to measure the success. Imagine that you'd be able to run a million different scenarios for your business of how you price and how you run these operations, and then see the results before they happen. That's exactly what a financial model is, right? So the I guess the answer to all these questions and how you get there is financial modeling and forecasting. That's the goal. And So just to make this a little bit more practical, I put some questions together, which we're actually going to run through in a financial model. But here are some items that I find are very common. I have a business, will it be profitable, right? So that's just, I have an idea at inception and I have no clue if it'll make money. What should I charge for my products or services? Where's my money going is a very common one. Should I add in this product line? How much volume do I need? Should I switch suppliers, right? I want to open up a new store. Should I raise prices? How can I predict? Like, we don't have to go through every one of these, but I'm sure these are universal challenges that often people don't have the time, focus, or energy to look at that can so easily be answered with financial model. So before we go into the financial modeling and forecasting 101, I guess if anybody has any of these or other ones that are relatable, we can add them to the list and maybe go through the financial model. But does this sound familiar to everybody? Or maybe
You
we
ask
can
everyone to
do,
raise their hand, by the way. That's the
yeah,
easiest thing for
you can
people.
raise hands. All right, so we can raise hands on Zoom. So if this is relatable, then everyone, if they could please raise their hands.
All right, I see a few hands going up.
We got some hands going up. Oh, okay, we got some nice hands. All right, cool. This is how we'll converse through sign language on this platform.
But later
So
we'll open up. We'll do, the Q&A. People could speak, but this is, for now, for quick interaction, just ask for the
for the hand raises, sounds
or they
good.
could type in the chat if someone wants to write something. They could type in the chat, and I'll filter it to you.
Okay, sounds good. So that brings us into number two, and then we'll eventually get into putting this in live, forecasting and modeling 101. So what is a forecast, right? What is this fancy number spreadsheet thing? So I like to say, and this is fancy words, quantitative depiction of qualitative reality, which basically means it just tells a story in numbers of what happened and when you expect to happen. It's essentially, people think of the business and their business plan and the financials as two separate things. That's not true. A financial forecast is your business plan written out in numbers. It's not two separate entities. If you have a business plan, it's going to translate into numbers and they're not going to lie. So they're going to match each other and they're two sides of the same coin. How is it created? So usually it's created in Microsoft Excel and it's usually by a CFO or FP&A analyst. They create the forecast. And what is it based on? It's based on historical numbers and other predictive insights, aka your business plan and everything that's happening in your company, and use the best available information that you have. It's important to note that there has never been and there never will be a financial forecast that is accurate to 100%. But if they're good at financial forecasts, they'll hopefully get within 95%. So the job of the FP&A analyst or CFO, whoever you're using to make this forecast, is to get it within the realm of not being off by too much. That's the goal. So just to give some credence behind it and to understand what this looks like. So there's a couple types of forecasts. We'll talk about two of them today. This is called a top-down forecast, right? And if you kind of go down and you look at that little revenue box in the income statement, you'll see that essentially you take what did I do last year, the last 2 years or 3 years in revenue, and you're going to put a percentage of growth on top of it, right? This would be a top-down forecast. So in 2022, someone did $39,117 of sales. And then I'm going to say, well, you know what? I have a few cases, maybe an upside case that I'm going to grow 9% a year, a base case at 7.5, or a downside case at 6%. I'm going to put it together, and that's what I think I'm going to do next year, right? Which is great, but it doesn't give you the whole picture of a lot of granularity, right? So it's efficient, it gives you a high level plan, but it doesn't have a lot of detail, it doesn't give you assumption sensitivity, it doesn't let you customize it to your specific business. So then there's another type of forecast, which you can see is a lot more detailed here, right? And that is what we'll call a bottoms up forecast. And the reason why it's called bottoms up is because you're building it from the bottom based on your entire company structure. You're actually going to figure out how much revenue is coming from each product line based on my price, based on my volume, or whatever those drivers are. And then you're going to build that up into a financial model so that you can, if you tweak one small nuance, you get a lot of granularity. And obviously, this is more complex. It takes more time. There has to be data available and there has to be more of a thought out plan. But it's pretty accurate and it allows you to run different scenarios and allows you to give you that granular detail. So with that all said, what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go into a financial model and we're going to test out some of these ideas. All right, let me know when you guys can see this. Okay, by raise of hands, I guess. Let me know when you guys can see this.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Just move this out here. Okay, so here we have a widget company in the widget industry that makes widgets. Okay, we can go back to my cover here. ABC is a provider of widgets for the widget industry, right? This is essentially what a big financial model will look like. And what we have here is we're going to just stick to the assumptions tab. It's a pretty robust financial model with some charts, some financial summaries, and a lot of other things going on. But we're just going to stick to the assumptions tab here because I want everybody to focus on how easy this could be with a financial model to actually make these actionable decisions. So, and for those who don't know, widgets just is a generic term for a product sold, and that's why we're using widgets. So, ABC company, you have here that they are a widget provider in the widget industry, and they sell two types of widgets. You have a $4 widget, and in 2024, they're expecting to sell 10,000 of them. Okay, and that gets you $40,000. Pretty simple math. You also have widget number B, which is a much more prestigious widget, and it's at $20, and it's a little bit more of a refined product, and so the volume is 3,000. And we can see that what's happening here is it's immediately translating over to this 2024 P&L, this profit and loss statement. So between the two widgets, I'm making about $100,000. I have my cost of goods sold on what it is on those widgets, and the only real expense here is that I have $45,000, which I pay myself as a salary for the CEO. Okay, so that's the company. Two widgets, and this is what they're selling them at. This is how much they sold, and there's one expense. Now, if we go down, this net income, it looks like they're losing $16,000. And so one of the questions we had is, where's all my money going, right? This little thing right here is I'm selling a lot of product. I'm only paying myself $45,000. Well, what's going on here? So this is a question that happens often. Why did this person price their product, or this is me. So why did I price my product at $4? Well, if I go down over here, I said, you know what? My material cost $2. And therefore, if I want to make a 50% margin, I'm going to price it at 4. I'll make 50%. What I forgot to do is I forgot to take into account all the different expenses that go into it, because there's packaging that costs $1 that I forgot to put in. There's shipping, which costs 50 cents. There's trucking, which costs another 75 cents. There's processing fees on the credit card, which cost 3% or 12 cents here. And there's other expenses, miscellaneous, that are 30 cents. So in actuality, my total cost is $4.67 for a widget that I had priced at $4. And inevitably, what's going to happen is that the more widgets I sell, because I forgot to take into account all of the actual price metrics, I am going to lose 17% on every single widget that I sell. And so I think, well, I really don't want to do that. So if I'm losing money now, I should really price my products at something that gives me that initial 50% margin. Maybe I can put it at $10. That might be a better idea of how to price my product so I don't lose money every day. And when I do that, I can see that, yes, I'm at a 52% margin. And in terms of what actually happened to my income, we had a negative $16,000. And now we're at $33,000 up. So that question of where's all my money going it's often because we're pricing products. We don't take into account all the different expenses, and we didn't even get to the fixed and operating expenses of that. But that's essentially what often happens, is that people don't have real control of their costs. So another question that we were going to get to is I want to introduce a new product line. how do I know if it's profitable, right? So I'm going to show you how very easily we can figure that out if we had a financial model. So we introduce yet another widget, widget C, which is perhaps the most prestigious of all the widgets, and it is a $45 widget. That is the price. And I think as I open up this widget, I can sell 5,000 of them, which is great because that means I just added $225,000 of revenue per year. So I can see here, let's look at the cost structure to make sure that it's actually viable. So if I go down to widget C here, even though my material cost is more, my material cost isn't $2, it's more like $12. If this will cooperate. Whatever, even though my material cost is $12, what's happening is that it's still a good price because I'm still pricing it at 45, that I still have a 65% margin. And on every single one that I sell, I'm gonna make more money on it. So then I say that's a good cost. Okay, so then in terms of bringing in new products and new pricing and all those things, we can very easily see what we should do in a financial model. Now, here comes another question, which is, should I open up a new warehouse? Should I make some type of large investment, right? And so let's run the scenario out. Let's say that I wanted to bring in a new investment in a warehouse for, I don't know, widget C. Let's just say widget C needed their own warehouse. But I think that widget C can give me another 10,000 widgets if I open this new warehouse. So I'm at 15,000, but I'm also going to need to hire an employee to do that. So I'm going to hire an employee here. My employee annual salary and benefits for $25,000. And we can see here, well, my net income has gone up from that initial 150 or so. But what happens, I need to take into account the actual cost of the new warehouse as well, right? So if I go down here and I plug in capital expenditures of $100,000, I want to see what actually happens to my cash flow. My cash flow is at $265,000 and my net income is at 352,000, which basically means that even though I spent $100,000 on a store, assuming that my price is accurate at $45 and my volume is accurate at 15,000, I am able to afford this and I should do it. Then the question becomes, well, what does cash flow look like on a monthly basis, right? Because to buy a store, I'm looking
Somebody
at
just
the,
posted a question in the chat.
sure, let me take a look
Maybe.
here. Let's see here. I don't see it. If you're able to read it, can you let me know?
Someone asked, how are you putting in the 25% marketplace charges and free shipping?
How am I putting it in?
They want, you know,
So,
what, yeah. Okay, that's, if they want to clarify, you could unmute yourself. Whoever just posed that question, you could explain your
sure.
question if you want. All right, I guess whoever that is doesn't want to unmute themselves. So how do you understand that? Yeah,
Yeah, so I think what I understand the question is if there's marketplace charges or there's anything else, what we can do is we can always add in here any type of line item that would be an additional cost structure. So let's just say somebody had a 25% marketplace charge, we'd make a new line and we would essentially add that in and then it would add into the new cost structure and then we'd be able to calculate our margin. So this is very dynamic and variable in the sense that you're able to make this reflect everything specific and tailor it to every type of business. I hope that answers the question.
yeah, it seems like it. Go ahead.
Okay. So the question that we had is I essentially put $100,000 to finance a warehouse. How does that affect my cash flow? Which is another question. So if I go to my cash burn analysis summary, in January of 2024, which is when I bought this warehouse, I made $69,000 in cash sales, but I usually only burn 39,000, but because I put $100,000 into a warehouse, all of a sudden I'm at $139,000, which means I'm burning $70,000. right? So what I'm able to do here is because I know that in X amount of time, I am going to buy a warehouse for 100,000. I can look at month by month and say, well, I'm going to be short $70,000 here. And then I need to figure out, do I get debt for that? Do I have to raise my prices for that? Do I have to do something in financing for that? Right? And essentially what this financial model does is it gives you that clarity and insight that you need that. So I think I guess like any other questions on the financial model before we go back, or any examples that somebody wants to see of how we can quickly update any of this. But the goal, I guess what I'm trying to convey is that the financial model is just your business plan and numbers, and it lets you run a million different scenarios how to do that, right? So if I wanted to change this to $100, and if I wanted to change this to 2,000, and I wanted to see how is it impacting my bottom line immediately, it's all going to be updated right here, right in front of you, and you're able to run every scenario under the sun.
So,
So
so
hopefully, Mhm.
yeah, so just to clarify then, at what point in a bit this you're going to share this model, or this is something that they have to be in touch with their accountant to create? And at what's how much money should a business be grossing before they start implementing business models like this?
So think of this as more like marketing. Marketing, every business needs marketing, every business needs accounting. So if someone is even a startup just with an idea and they wanted to sell widgets, three types of widgets in the widget industry, they should make a financial model before they even open up the business. Because how are you going to open up a business and not know if it's going to make money? If you're only able to price at $10, or let's say in our example before, if let's just say you were only able to price at $4, and you're expecting to sell 10,000 widgets, but you have no clue that essentially you're losing $4.67. Your COGS are $4.67. That's a losing business model. So I wouldn't open up a business without knowing if it's going to be profitable or having to adjust it as you need in order to make sure it's profitable. So that's even for a startup. Then when somebody's already in operations, let's say they're at a few 100,000 or 100,000, 200,000, a few million of revenue, like you have all of these systems built out, you have all of these line items in one place. You need to get a financial model to figure out what am I gonna do next year? How am I gonna grow? And what employees am I going to hire? What investments am I going to make? That all should be played out here before it actually happens, because then you can adjust as needed instead of flying blind. So I guess to directly answer the question, this is not a stage of business. Every single business should have something like this. And every single business should have this tailored to their specific business. And I think like it's obviously something that Warrior does. So if anybody wants something like this, feel free to be in touch with me about it. But unless they have an in-house CFO, then it's usually not going to happen, right? This is kind of why Warrior was created, to help these businesses do that. Does that make sense, everybody?
Yes, it makes sense, but I guess my question really is, and like, in terms of like, uh, since many people that are on this webinar are, small businesses, and maybe they never thought of it. What, in other words, I'm fumbling on my question over here. Why is it that so many small businesses don't do it if it's such an obvious thing? Like what's the gap, so to say?
Yeah, so I think one of the points that I covered, and let me actually share my screen and go back to the slide. Let me know if you guys are able to see this.
Yeah.
So the reason why businesses don't do this is because they're focused on operations first. And financial literacy and accuracy isn't a given. And essentially, that type of push to actually look at the business from a model and a lens like this is very difficult when you're trying to fly the plane and land it at the same time. So it often comes down to expertise and training and financial literacy, the fact that it's already a chaotic function, a chaotic business, and also the fact that operations will come first. I need to do something before I analyze it and look at it, right? So I just think that those are some of the reasons why that happens.
So you're basically making a statement then that from your perspective, that it's a obligation for every small business owner, just like they're planning the operation sides, they're making a inherently flawed mistake by waiting too long to implement financial modeling into their business. That's more or less what you're saying?
Yes, that's 100% what I'm saying.
Okay,
And I
got it.
think I think that I think it's just something that isn't known as well in the small business world. And I think that essentially it's something that should be, right? Which is why I hope that this is helpful for people to
Well,
understand how much could be, I guess, how much they could avoid in terms of trial and error and other things if that would happen.
well, I would just say from my vantage point, you mentioned many businesses don't start doing this till they hire their CFO. A lot of businesses, especially startup businesses, are on a very small, on a tight budget. And they probably think that this is a luxury thing to do. Like, how can
Right, that's
somebody do this?
where,
Yeah.
right. So that's why when you don't have something in-house CFO, that's where outsourced CFOs and companies like Warrior are able to do this on a much cheaper budget and you don't have somebody do it full time. That's essentially the business gap that we're filling at Warrior.
Mm. But if somebody feels like they're not ready to take on consulting for this, are there like free templates out there that people could use to plug in, at least get a starting point? Or
Well,
it's only
we're gonna get into what the starting points are. The short answer is that there are probably some paid templates that work, but it may not be as effective. But there's very limited amount in the free world. But let me maybe move on and get to the into how people can think about financial modeling and forecasting for their business, if that's okay.
by all means.
All right, so hopefully this will help. So how you can start, right? Which I think is the question everybody was getting at. Do we have something in the chat? We'll come back to the chat question at the end. Okay, how you can start. So, an income statement, right? Your profit and loss sheet, right? This is your revenue and your expenses. And I guess the way to really take the first step here is to start thinking about your business in this way, right? So I think, how does your company bring in money? Every single company universally has money that comes in and money that goes out. And then the next question is okay, well, what are those buckets of revenue? So if there's a brave volunteer, maybe we can take a volunteer who has a business that'd be willing to share what are the buckets that bring in money for you? What are your buckets of revenue? It could be products, could be customers, but if anybody is willing to unmute themselves and do it, that'd be a good start. Any brave volunteers that want to be an experiment?
Love to be, but I don't have a business yet to share numbers with.
Well, fine. Well, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna make a hypothetical business then. So give me a hypothetical business, and
I
then
have
we'll
a,
do it
I
that
mean,
way.
I'm working on a business right now. I can give you hypothetical numbers for, but like I said, it's all up in the air.
Okay, well, let's start with, can you give me an industry in
Online
term?
education.
Did
Okay,
you hear me?
yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, I can do it. I can ask you a few questions, or you can ask me a question you're gonna do. I have a business running now. My question is about, item cost me $20. Okay, what is the margin profit have to be? And you want to know how I'm bringing money to the business from sales. I'm bringing money. But the
What was the
question,
first part? What was the business? I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
if the item, the cost of goods sold is $20.
Hmm.
Okay, before all the other expenses. What is have to be the margin profit? This is the question number one. I'm bringing revenue to the business now from sales. If I'm missing something, I have to take a loan, but I'm trying to bring from sales.
Sure. So I guess I'll come back, Mr. Gordon, on online education, but I think there's never a what does your margin have to be, right? I think that the way you want to think about it is once you have a financial model, you're able to see what's my revenue that I'm bringing in. I want a margin that obviously is profitable. So let's just say, for example, your margin's 50% per item, because those margins are going to have to cover all of your employees and then your warehouse and whatever operating costs. So it's not really on a per item basis. It depends in terms of how you want to get the best price that you can, right? So what are people still willing to pay for that I can charge? That's a profitable margin. Then the second step is understanding, okay, now that I've taken into account those costs, I want to take into account my fixed costs, my employees, my payroll, my warehouse, all of those things. And I need to make sure that the leftover margin is able to cover that. So let's just say that you sold something for $100 and your cost of goods sold was 20. So you had $80 left, you have an 80% margin. That 80 needs to be able to cover all of your other fixed costs, like your warehouse, like your employees. So there really just needs to be specific and dependent on your business. And that's why obviously a financial model helps you see that. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, but if it's always extra expenses, but you're not thinking about it, you're making the model.
Well, that's why when you're able to really see all those expenses at once and put them together, you really have to think about what could be the possible expenses, and you give yourself a little bit of room in case they came up. So in the financial model, we had other miscellaneous expenses because wrapping paper came up, right? Or something like that came up. And in order to adjust for that, we need to ensure that we account for some level of conservatism when we do that.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully there aren't too many.
Because on the chart you put, you're missing a lot of massive expenses in business, like advertisement, rent, other expenses, CPC, PPC, you know, returns, losing
Sure.
after delivery. It's not finishing this
Well, that was only the gross margin. That was only the variable expenses. There's like 100 more lines of fixed expenses as well that account for things like that. But the point was just to show on the gross margin, all of those other things are taken into account as well on the fixed side too. But that's a good point.
Yeah,
Just back,
this is what I'm
there's
trying to figure out. What you show on the Excel sheet, you know, the item costs $20. What is the margin I have to put? Because the the expenses you put there, it's almost zero from the real expenses in the reality of life.
Well, yes, I'm saying each business is going to have their own financial model, right? So let's just say in a tailored setting, your business will have your own revenue based on how many items you're going to sell. You're going to have your own variable expenses, right? Based on how many you're going to sell and what those costs are. And then you're going to put in your specific, what's my employees and everything else. And then in order to basically solve for that, you can run different scenarios in the financial model, and with that, you're able to figure out how you should price it. So if your bottom dollar is still negative because you have other very big expenses that are not in necessarily the per unit, then you should be upping your prices or lowering those expenses. So your margins are not, there's 48% margin is the great margin. It's more of that you need to figure out how to price your products based on your entire business. And each business should have their own tailored financial model.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So, yeah, good question though. So let's go back. So higher education, right? That was the example we're doing here. So in the buckets that would make up higher education business, how would you think about it? How does money come into that company?
Have to sell the course, right? The educational course.
Yeah. So I would think about it almost like instead of widgets sold, I would think of how many courses sold, and you're going to have a price per course, and then you'll,
Definitely high. That might be a shocking number, but in a perfect world, anywhere from 10 to 15 grand and even higher. It's a very premium niche course that we're trying to do. So those are kind of what we're looking to do. And obviously, I recognize without a lot of context that might sound ridiculous, but that is the dollar figure that I'm working with right now.
well, that's the beauty of a financial model. Anything is possible.
That's fair.
Right? Whether it plays out in the real world is a question, but anything is possible in a financial model, right? So obviously you need to validate the thesis and all of that. But so in this case, your revenue is going to be the courses that you bring in, right? The courses and the dollar amount per course, and then the total of how many people actually take it. And so let's think about your expenses then, right? What are your expenses? What costs you money in this business idea?
I mean, especially right now, because we're at the startup phase, we're trying to go lean, but for sure, the actual cost of creating the content, so all the video production, advertising to actually, market it to our customers, web hosting platforms, as well. I think that those are right now we're not working on a model where we pay the teacher to do the actual teaching. It's kind of a rev share model thereafter. So that is a cost, but that's also after we've gotten the money. So we can include it as an expense, but I think it's a kind of a different type of expense maybe. But I would say at the very
Yep.
production for the course, the advertising for the course, web hosting, I know for a fact are big three. And then eventually down the line, of course, there's like salespeople, operation and stuff. But for right now, where we're at, those main three are kind of my main expenses, I think, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we were to plug that into how do we make a forecast? So I would say if I expect to sell, let's just say 20 courses at this price point, then that's already the bucket of revenue. That's how I know my revenue's coming in. And I expect to scale that 25, 30 courses a year. And obviously you have to pay attention to why that input is that what it is. That's your revenue input, right? That's how you can forecast it. On the expense side, if we're able to put numbers, let's say you took 5% of your revenue and put it into advertising, or let's say you had employee salaries, let's just say you had it at 50,000 and you had 2 employees, right? Then all of a sudden you have your expenses and you have the basic outline of what your forecast looks like. It's just taking your ideas, putting numbers on it, and then putting it in. So I think that's a great way to think about it.
Mhm. I'm curious from your perspective, if you have any guidance or opinion on how to determine what the sale price would be and an estimated sales volume. And I say that because, of course, the online educational space it's fairly mature, of course, with Masterclass, Skillshare, all those types of products, but the
Mhm.
niche that I'm working in hasn't necessarily been exposed yet. And I apologize. I'd like to keep that, private for right now.
Sure.
But, how could you, at least in your opinion, project price of product and number, quantity of revenue sold when it is a product, a niche that hasn't been explored yet, and it's a higher ticket offer like what I am trying to do.
Yeah, it's a great question. So do you mind just holding it for the Q&A? And that could be our first question there, because I think it's a good question that I want to hit. Is that
No
good?
much.
Okay, awesome. So let's take a look at balance sheet, right? So we did the revenue. How would I forecast something like a balance sheet? And I'm going to ask for another volunteer here. And I want to understand what are your terms with customers in terms of how long it takes them to pay you, right? Is it due on receipt? Is it half up front, half later? Is it net 30, net 60? Any other brave volunteers in the audience that want to tell me what type of terms they commonly offer their customers? All right, we're going to make up a hypothetical
Okay, I'll
situation
go.
then. Go ahead.
Okay, so what are we, hold on, let me just close the door.
I can answer you what I'm doing. I'm selling on marketplaces. The people paying right away credit card to the marketplace, I'm getting the money between 2 weeks to 60 days, different which marketplace.
Okay, awesome. So, and then,
If I'm selling on my site, if the order coming through my site, then the money coming into my account in 12 hours.
okay, so it's
Different
between 2 weeks and 60 days. Got it.
Yeah, these are the
Okay,
marketplaces. On my private site, it's overnight. Everything closed till
got
6
it.
o'clock in 8 o'clock in the morning. It's a bank account.
Okay, okay. Understood on that part. And then how long do you have to pay your suppliers?
I'm bringing everything direct from China, and you have to pay in advance.
Okay, so essentially what happens in your business is that you have to be out of pocket money in order to sell.
Big money.
Right. So what's interesting is that if you can use your balance sheet to your advantage, you're able to renegotiate, you're able to see that how much money is tied up in my business just because of my terms with my customers and suppliers. So for example, imagine that if you had your customers, and obviously some is possible, some is not, but let's say your customers were all paying in advance, and that way you were able to fund all of your deposits and purchases to your overseas in China, then all of a sudden you wouldn't be out of money and have however much money tied up in the business, right? You would essentially just be able to get those in advance as well, right? So it's really important on the balance sheet side, is just by your terms of your suppliers and your customers, if you're able to get more favorable terms, meaning get your customers to pay you quicker and your suppliers have longer to pay them or a different construct of how to pay them, you have less money tied up in the business that you can use for other things. And I know that we cut off someone else who's in the middle of talking. If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I can go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, so where should I start?
I guess like in terms of what we talked about customers and suppliers, can I hit you on cash flow?
Sure.
All right.
Um,
Any large investments in
yes,
terms of the company recently?
yes.
Okay, hit me.
So, so my company is a combination of emergency training, mainly CPR, basic life support, and
Mm-hmm.
and products.
Okay.
We're kind of a niche right now, wherein it's specifically defibrillators,
Okay.
automated external defibrillators that we sell. Some things are added, but that's the company right now. We've been going on that for a while already. I deal mainly with nursing homes, but also
Okay.
like schools and schools. Of late been dealing more with trainings for schools and schools.
Got it. Okay. So what's any large investments recently in one-time purchases? It could be like anything from rebranding of a website to inventory to technology, anything like that.
So inventory. If we're going on a big one, it's inventory. I one like two bigger expenses recently has been more trade shows.
Okay.
I'm going to have one tomorrow and had another two in the last um 3 months, which also
Okay.
also include the marketing for it. So I guess that would be um about 7,500, seven and a half
Okay.
thousand dollars between marketing and advertising for those. As far as the inventory, so initially when I first started the business, I was specifically drop shipping. That was part of my background as I created a drop shipping department in my last job. And over here, I was doing that for a long time, but issues with rubber and other things caused stock issues across the industry. So I
Okay.
started having to forecast ahead and started taking in. So right now I have about 90,000 in inventory.
Got it. And so it could be inventory, it could be anything else, right? It could be, like I said, rebranding a website, it could be a new store, something like that. How did you finance that inventory?
Um, I mainly took it out of savings. Honestly, I
Okay.
basically I basically took um a big chunk of it came from revenue over the last 3 years. Let's say 30% of it was from revenue from the last couple of years. Um, Other parts are mainly from my savings. I have negotiated. I have 30-day terms with my suppliers, and then I put everything on my credit card, which gets me another 45 days.
Yep.
And yeah, then from there I basically self-funded it from my own savings.
Right. So with a financial model, what could have happened also is if you were able to, let's say, forecast, hey, in 6 months from now, I'm going to need X amount of inventory. You could
Hmm.
even use like, hey, I need to price my products a little bit differently and take, let's say, $1 extra of those pricing of the products and put it towards savings for that inventory.
Oh
Or
wait,
figure,
so that was one more point that I should have added. The bigger reason was not just the stock issues. It was my price per item was going to go from on one that I'd sold, let's say 30 of over the last 12 months. It was going to go from 1,200 to 1,330.
Mhm.
So I tried to calculate, what the cost of that money would be to me, as but sitting in a high yield savings account, making 4.5, 5%. What would be the difference in the upside between buying it now at 1,200 plus shipping, so really 1,225, and then have to ship it out again 1,250, as opposed to 1,350. So that $100, I tried to calculate
The
if I'd
difference.
be
Yeah.
able to sell them over the next year to 2 years, whether it was worth it or not.
Yeah.
That
So, I
was where I'd
mean,
say about 75% of my inventory, and the other ones are other ones that I
as it
tried to
comes.
guess what sales would be.
Got it. Yeah, so I mean that's a spot where a lot of people are in, right? I mean, the good thing is that you forecasted it, right? So you actually put some time and effort into understanding what it would be like. I'd say a lot of people, what happens is they come up to a, hey, I really need inventory right now, and then they're scrambling in personal savings in order to get it.
Right.
So I think it's the ability to forecast in advance, which it sounds like you did some of, and then if you had an entire financial model, then you can make a holistic decision of saying, well, if my inventory is going to jump in terms of pricing in 6 months from now, maybe I need to be proactive about it instead of reactive and price differently or go to a different supplier and so on, right? It just gives you that foresight.
Mhm.
So I definitely understand the decision you made, and I think you were smart about it too.
I
So
appreciate it. Did kind of learn from, I'd had a similar question the year before, and I didn't
right,
make that
you
decision,
didn't,
and then I said like it because it was essentially putting down $100,000, which I said was just
right,
too much. But
right.
when it went up again another $130, I said, okay, now's the time to do it. However, there was one caveat, which I'm not sure how you'd be able to do with the spreadsheets, which is where the question would come in.
Sure,
There was a
let's
specific
let's
product.
switch to Q&A now, and we'll get to the
Okay.
and then we'll start there. Okay, go
Okay.
ahead.
So there was another product. Part of why I was able to sell 30 units of a specific one,
Hmm.
and the accessories had to do with the fact that there was a certain product that was off the market that we knew
Okay.
was going to come back at some point, but they had to redo the model and it's going to take them whatever time. So what I was nervous about, which is kind of what happened to a point, is that when this other cheaper thing came back in, people weren't going to want the more expensive one as much, especially with the industry I deal with, mainly with nursing homes. So how would you kind of try to factor that in? Obviously numbers are numbers. How do you try to factor that in with like, okay, do I make that decision to buy the excess inventory, knowing that it's possible that that other factor is going to knock it out?
That's a great question. So we're gonna get in, that's a little bit more in the advanced category of forecasting, but essentially everything in real life can be quantified into a model. There's not a scenario that you can't put some type of numbers behind. So the question is, you have to actually do the legwork to understand what's the nuance and how many people would drop out, right? So you can't just if you put garbage into a financial model, you'll get garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were on the ground and talking with your actual customers, and you'd ask them, or you'd figure out somehow, if you don't need to ask them directly, what is the likelihood that you would switch over to this product if it's viable, right? This cheaper option, right? And if they tell you I'm for sure switching, let's say one person says I'm for sure switching, one person says no way, I'm sticking with your product. You can take a small sample size, and let's say you have 10 or 15 customers, and then you're able to figure out, okay, well, if of my 10 customers, 5 of them are switching, that means I'll retain 50% of my customers, and I should probably retain about 50% of the inventory. Would be one way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Another way to do it would be probability weighted, meaning that let's assume everything goes as normal and there's a 65% chance that you get replaced, right? So I'm going to maintain 35% of my inventory with a little bit of buffer. But essentially what you're looking at doing is take a small sample size of your customers, understand what their decisions are based off, right? This is a little bit of economics that comes in. What's their taste? What are they looking at? What's it about this new product? What's the probability that they're not going to sign up with me again? And then you're able to forecast based on that. That's how I would do it.
Okay. I mean, I do have access to that other product also. It's a matter of more taking on the bigger inventory of the newer product as opposed to them going back to it. Additionally, also, what would you say about looking at looking at the year before, the industry the year before? I mean, my sales were much higher last year than the year before that. So I don't know if I'd have the same sample size. So you have to look at my own sales and say, like, okay, before when this was on the market, I was selling this amount, compared to the, of newer unit to older unit.
Yep. So there's a couple of variables that go into market demand, right? Essentially, what you're getting into is less about the financial forecast, more about the inputs that go into it, right? And how do you determine what those inputs
Yeah.
are going to be? So generally, you have market demand, which is the market growing? Is it hot? What are the unit economics, right? So, a good example of that would be pet. Pet 5 years ago, 6 years ago, was a much smaller market than it is today. During the COVID boom, everybody got animals, and all of a sudden, you have a ridiculously large market. So, what you can assume is, and you can look online, right, Statista and all these different websites, that they're essentially doing this type of work, and they're figuring out what is the market demand, and they gauge it. Where's the market going, right? And they'll give some type of growth rate for a year by year, which you could probably assume for market size. If the market's shrinking and it's drying up, then it's probably not a great product to be selling, and your margins will probably go down and be compressed because there's not going to be enough demand for it. So on the market side, the first thing is look at the macro market side. Then you look at who are your customers, who are you selling products to, what is going to influence their taste and demand. If their procurement process is controlled, let's say by government, and they have regulations they have to uphold, that they have to use the newest and greatest, you could get wiped down to zero. right? So it's being on top of the regulatory landscape as well. Then it's appetite in terms of purchase price. Because of their specific businesses, are they feeling pressure or not? And if they are, do they have room to pay for this? And do they have room to pay for this at what price? Then you look at your historical inputs and you say, you have to really deep dive into the numbers. Why did they purchase it? What's the use of it? And will that continue? Right? So you really have to think about the purchaser and the customer decision process and the market to understand what your inputs could be. You mix that with your insights of your own business, and then you come out with insights. So just for an example, let's say last year, 2 years ago, it was COVID and people sold a lot of masks and gloves. Essentially, that market has dried up and the pricing went down tremendously. So now all of a sudden margins are going to be compressed, right? And then the other part of it is, well, who was buying it then? Well, it was nursing homes and other people. Well, now they're getting it from larger suppliers. Do they have the money for it, right? So I think it's just being able to really think through the market and the customer decision-making process and mix that with your own historical business insights is extremely helpful when you try to look at these inputs. And it's not an exact science. It's not a specific number. And like I said, it's not the point of the financial model isn't to be exact. It'll always be wrong, but it's hopefully to get you insight and to get you very close.
And get you comfortable with the decision that you're making.
100%.
Okay, great answer. Thank you.
I think we had a question from before for Mr. Gordon, right? In terms of how do you look at the niche and how do you think about and forecast what people would pay and how many?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, so I guess we answered some of it in the previous question of how are you looking at pricing and things like that, and it really comes down to the unit economics. What is the customer willing to pay? When venture capital firms do this all the time, venture capital firms, they're basically being pitched ideas. Someone has an idea, let's just say in your case, it's higher education. What's that niche? And so you think about, well, we'll call it the target market, right? What's my target audience? So is it only for people who are, let's say, between 25 and 35? What's that population in the US? Of those, is it only in this, like, I don't know, the Midwest, or is it only in the East Coast? Is it only a specific type of person with a degree, right? So you have to first figure out what's my total target customer of everybody that I could target. And then you start looking at the demographics. If you're looking at a younger population, right? So then let's just say with my big target market is like 1 million people. And then I say, well, you know what? They need to be able to afford something that's, let's say, $20,000. All of a sudden, your target market is down to, let's say, 200,000 people. People that need this specific item because they've already gotten a doctorate, you're down to 10 or 15,000 people. Of those 10 to 15,000 people, you go in and you ask, I don't know, 100 of them or something like that, would you buy this product for X amount? Right? So you kind of go from broad to narrow. And then once you're narrow enough that you have a sample size, you're going to get some type of common denominator from, let's say, 50 people or something like that. That's why you're always seeing these random surveys, because that data helps inform about pricing and decisions of how the companies will price their products. So again, there's no perfect answer, but the process is go large to understand who your market is serving, and then go narrow until you have a sample size to choose from and ask who your target audience is, and then get into the customer decision.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. One follow-up question to that.
Sure.
So it is, but yeah, basically higher education for professionals who have, professional degrees. So of course it's going to be a smaller market. So for example, I saw that there was someone who was selling a 5-day in-person training course for my target demographic that cost $15,000, right? So in my opinion, I say, okay, same demographic, similar skill set, same price point, but different format, right? In person 5-day event versus online on demand. So my question to you is that a comp that I can use to set my price, or is that technically apples and oranges because it's a different format and delivery of education?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you touched on this is a good point. Another way to figure out pricing is obviously look at comparables, right? That's how in the investment banking world we figure out how much a company is worth by intrinsic valuation, but also by relative valuation, meaning looking at other companies that are similar and then how much they sell for, and then coming out with some type of metric that enables us to look at that specific company. That is a very good question for somebody who's an industry expert or a customer, right?
Okay.
Somebody who's not able to, if I were to sit here and answer, is that a comp or not? it goes down to, does the customer view it as a comp, right? If the customer thinks that an in-person class is infinitely more valuable than an online class, and they'd only be willing to pay $500 for an online class, but $15,000 for an in-person class, that's how you have to think about it, right? At the end of the day, the purchase decision is going to be someone handing you money. That person handing you money has to be willing to do that. So is it a comp or not? It really depends on your demographic, and it depends on how they make that decision. So there's probably two ways to get it. One, sample size is to understand what they'd be willing to pay. And B, you have to talk about somebody who's either done this or has taken this, and then ask them how they would view it as a comp. But again, it goes back to, will the customer give you their money and how much will they give you? It's not a matter of like, if I have conceptually two different, water bottles, one of them is $100,000, the other's $5,000. How do I know how the customer gets to there? You have to ask them.
Got it. I appreciate that. Thank you very much for your insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions?
so-
I know we're coming up on time.
Yeah, we're coming up at the end of the hour. I would just, I mean, for me, just in terms of actionable for people,
Mhm.
if they wanted to act on this and they weren't in a position yet to actually hire somebody, how could somebody do this on their own? Or is there any
Yeah.
way to get it as close to that?
Yeah, I mean, so part of what we went through earlier was, in terms of actionability, it's try and think through these scenarios. How does your company make money? Where do you spend it? Write down all of your revenue of the buckets that come up, write down all of your costs, the buckets that come up, right? So it's customers, it's locations, or whatever it is to your specific business. Write it down all on a piece of paper and run it through a calculator. Like, that's essentially the fancy version of a financial model, financial forecast. In terms of like your cash flow and things like that, just you have to, again, it's a little bit of a science in it, but it all comes down to what is happening in your business, where's their money going in, where's their money going out. If there's large one-time purchases, you have to think about it in advance. How am I going to forecast it? Right? So it's really, try to the best of your ability, play out the entire business plan, and then assign costs to each part of it. That's the best way to do it. Obviously, that won't give you a whole picture, but at least it'll give you a place to start. And then when you start making decisions, you can kind of repeat that process as well.
Understood. And you mentioned that there were any types of templates that were available to people, or
There's really not so much available. Everything that's online is paid that I've seen. And then in terms of like specific items, like that you would want to tailor to your business, templates are difficult to come by that are free in this arena.
got it. Okay. Thank you very much, Donny. This was very enlightening. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Of course, it's been recorded, and you need to review it, let us know. We'll give you access, and wishing all of you a wonderful week and a wonderful month. God willing, next month's webinar is going to be on UX design. Okay, people to have their businesses, especially online businesses, having your website set up properly so that's easy for people to navigate, and making sure your products are easily understood. That's what discussion of next month's webinar. So hope to see you again. Have a wonderful week. All the best. Thank you, Donny.
Right.